Hello, my name is Steinmetz for BlenderDiplom.com, and in this two-part tutorial I'd like to show you how to create and use normal maps. Normal maps are a way of faking bumps and dents in your objects, and you can see on this image the bumps are real. You can see that especially in this area where the geometry is actually sticking out of the stairs, as opposed to this image where you can see that for flat ankles it basically looks the same. There's not much of a difference, but as soon as your ankle gets steeper, you can see that the normal map does not produce actual geometry and it's not able to displace your surface. So the question remains, why would we use normal maps? And the answer is very simple. In image number 1, we had about 250,000 faces just to get this nice and smooth. And in the right image, we had about 900, while the stairs consist of 4 faces only. So this is especially useful in games where performance is key, but it's also very handy for cycles as well, since it looks very good, and especially in background objects, it's very important to save geometry. And by that, of course, I mean the number of faces we have in a scene. If you want more information on normals, how they work and what they actually do, please watch this video on BlenderDiplom.com. The link is below. If you're on YouTube, the other advantage there is you have chapter markers. You can skip parts that you already know. And this tutorial is going to be a little different because just showing you how to actually bake something can be pretty short, but there are a lot of sources of error that can occur when baking normals. So I'm actually going to make a few of those errors just to show you how to circumvent them, how to prevent them, and how to deal with them. So if you're watching this tutorial from YouTube, I would suggest you go over to our homepage. The link is below because there you have chapter markers and you can skip the parts that you're actually familiar with and you don't need any help with. Okay, so let's switch to Blender Internal. And the differences are actually quite large, even though the end result looks very, very similar. And I actually really like this because this way you have two very different methods at your disposal and you can choose whichever you prefer. So let's dive right in. For baking I need a UV unwrap and also I need the properties. So I'll drag this little triangle here, and down here where the cube is I'll choose properties. Let's make a little more space here, and if I scroll down all the way you'll see this tab here, bake. I'll activate it. And let's just have a very brief look at the options. I could bake to vertex colors, but let's have a look at the vertex color. If I press V, I can paint on the vertex colors, and you can see the smallest dot I can make on this cube is actually this large. So baking to the vertex color is very coarse unless you heavily subdivide your mesh. So we're going to bake to an image texture. I'll press V again to get out of vertex paint mode and let's check clear. Clear means nothing more exciting than it will erase the entire image, make it alpha, and then we'll bake on top of that blank canvas. If you leave this off, you have the option to bake several objects onto the same map, or actually, let's put it this way, you can use the same map for several objects, because if, for example, you were to bake one object in this corner and one object over here, if you use clear, then whichever object is baked last will override this portion, even though there are no faces in there. So, well, I think even though that explanation was a bit too long, I think clear basically speaks for itself. Margin is if your islands are very close together, you might decrease the margin, but in general, the settings are actually good as they are. Now let's set up the cube so we can start baking. If I were to press bake right now, it will show me that no objects or images found to bake to. And of course we have an object active, so the error message is no image found to bake to. And to assign an image to this cube, we first need to unwrap it, because of course how else is Blender supposed to know where to bake? Now I'm going to use Smart UV Project. In general, it'll work fine. So if you have a more complex object, you'll have to do a better job unwrapping it. Since every program understands UVs, the only way to actually bake normals is by UV unwrapping your object, so Blender knows what information to store or to write in which part of your image. You can't bake in edit mode, but if we were to press the bake again, there would still not be an image found, because you can see the canvas over here is empty. So we need to choose an image or open one. It doesn't make too much sense to actually open one, because it will get overwritten entirely by this method. So we'll just create a new one. And you can name your image here. Let's call it bake. And you can, these settings don't make much of a difference except for width and height. You should always put this as large as possible, keeping in mind that every texture will use RAM in your rendering, and therefore you shouldn't overload your scene, but you shouldn't go too small, because if you zoom in on your object, you lose detail. Okay, so now we have a blank image to bake to, and we can actually bake, but right now nothing would happen because there's actually nothing to bake from. Because the way baking works is in Blender Internal, you can just choose any geometry you want. Let's set it to smooth and press Ctrl 2 to get a subsurf modifier, and I'll rotate this 90 degrees around the x-axis, and then I'll just put it here. And we need, the bake option only refers to the active object, so we need to have our cube active, and let's bake. And I clicked full render. First we need to select normals here, and then you have a couple of options more actually. Bake from multi-res, we'll cover that in the end of the chapter, and the normal space is tangent. I'm not going to cover the other two. Let's just click bake. Okay, so nothing happens. And I'm not sure exactly why this is. All I know for sure is if you choose selected to, let's read this, selected to active, and then you select all the objects you want to include in the bake, and then press bake again, that works. So yeah, I'm uncertain how to bake without this selected. And I keep getting phone calls from people who say, can you help me real quick? I don't know how to bake. I always get different error messages. So yeah, to prevent that, I usually use selected to active, because the error messages you get are actually, or sometimes no error message at all. It just doesn't work. So I sort of made the convention for myself. I'm not sure if it's necessary, but if you use selected to active, select all the objects that you need, and then bake. This usually works. Let's do this again so we don't have the cropped ears, and there we go. Now if you want to preview your baked texture, you can easily set up a material, but you'll need GLSL shading, because the multi-texture does not support normal maps. So I have a material assigned to it. I'll need to choose an image texture here, because I want to choose the one that we just baked. So we need to go down here and select the bake. There we go. We need to map it to the UVs. And in image sampling, you can turn on normal maps. That is supposed to help. Usually the result is also visible if you don't, but let's do that. And if I now press Alt and Y, you can actually see quite clearly that This part is weird and this part seems to be working, but let's insert another lamp so we can see it a lot better. And there we go. It looks like the monkey is stenciled. So it's kind of coming out at this part. Let's lower the... There we go. Now at the edges of the monkey you can clearly see that the geometry appears to be displaced. It's not just the image of the monkey painted on the cube. There's some actual geometry displacement, and you can see that if I rotate the light, that it almost looks like I modeled the monkey out of the cube, or maybe they're intersecting. Anyways, this is the trick that normal maps do, but let's analyze this scene. The monkey is pointing towards this face, so I actually wanted this effect on the other side of the face and inverted. So this looks like it's sticking out, but I wanted this to be pushed in just as you see it over here. And here, what I get here was just a mirrored copy or a mirrored image of the monkey head. And if we have a look at this, if you know normal maps a little better, then you know that these are the colors that appear in a good tangent normal map. It's usually mostly blue because this is the neutral color, and you have a lot of pink and sometimes some green if there are sort of opposing sides. Then this side will be pink and this side will be green because the curvature is basically the same. To you guys out there with vector math skills, please don't flame me on this. I'm just trying to make this as simple as possible. So normal maps have mostly these colors, and these colors you see from camera space or world space, but in tangent space they don't do the right thing. And you can easily verify that because this does not look like it's stenciled. This just looks like it's painted on, whereas this looks nice and stenciled. You can even see the specula going around that monkey. So what went wrong? The simple answer is normals. So let's have a look at the normals. If I go into edit mode by pressing tab, I can choose normals, and let's make them a little longer. And you can plainly see that those blue lines go out of the cube. That means the normals of the cube all point outside. Now let's have a look at the monkey. And of course, same thing. The normals of the monkey also point outside, which means that the normal of these faces is pointing in the opposite direction than the normal of these faces. But we sort of want to unify those faces. We want to take the high detailed information from these faces and combine them with the low poly information of this face, but they're pointing in opposite directions. So this won't work. Let's press Ctrl F and flip the normals. Let's bake this again. And we'll see there's an error message. Circular reference in texture stack. Now the reason for that is that if you're baking normals, you can actually use old normal maps and combine them with the world bake that you're about to make. So you can actually use the whole texture stack to influence your baked normal map in addition to what you bake in the viewport. So in order to rebake this, I need to disable the influence, go back to my baking, and then bake this again. Okay, so back into textured view. I can do this by hitting Alt Z. I need, of course, to reactivate the map now, and now it looks better. This side now has the relief, whereas this side is blunt. I don't care too much about that, because this is the side I'm interested in, but still I don't want this side to have the monkey too. I only want it on this side. So I press Alt H again, deactivate this, go back to the render tab so we can bake again, and this time I'll choose a distance. By default the distance is 0, so it will basically use everything or infinity distance. So even though the face is far away from the monkey and this face, it still gets painted on. So I'll decrease the system to 0.1. I actually increased it from 0, but 0 is infinity, so I'll call it a decrease. And bake this again. Now this is supposed to be in Blender units, so in theory a distance of 0.1 should be more than enough to bridge this little gap. Why doesn't it? Because the distance is actually going from the origin of your object to the closest face of any other object. And this is more than 0.1 Blender units, so I'll increase the distance to 1. That shouldn't do anything because the dimensions of the cube are 2, so this is about half. So we are exactly at the rim of the cube, so I'll increase this some more. Something like this, and you can now see nothing happens because the monkey wasn't selected, and I'll bake again, and there we go. Monkey starts appearing. If I increase this again, you can see now we have the whole monkey here. And it's only on the side I wanted it at. So this is my workflow for this operation. I choose selected to active, and then I'll select all the objects I want to include in the bake. Set the correct distance so they don't paint all over the place, and then I'll click bake. Now there's one last option, and that is called bake from multi-res. Let's use that. For this I'm just going to move the monkey to layer 2 and go into solid view. I'll press Alt R and Alt G so it's nice in the middle and unrotated, but you see it has a weird dark gray tone to it. And that is because the normals are still pointing inside. Now we can either press Ctrl N to recalculate them automatically, or we can press Ctrl F again and flip the normals. So let's exchange the subsurf modifier by a multi-resolution modifier, because bake from multi-res is exactly referring to the multi-resolution, and by default the multi-resolution doesn't do a thing, and that is because we need to subdivide it manually. Now I'm going to do this just twice, and you can see the monkey looks just as it would with the subsurf modifier. It's smoothed out, and there have been a lot of faces created. Now, the way the multi-resolution is different from the subsurf modifier is it has a sculpt mode. So let's go into sculpt mode, and I'll use the sculpt brush and sort of paint like a mustache on the monkey, something like that. Just so we have some displaced geometry we can look at. Okay, I could do a lot more, but we just have to identify these parts and we're fine. Let's just... That'll work. Don't worry. Now, of course, monkey needs to be unwrapped as well, so I'll press U again, Smart UV project, because how it's unwrapped doesn't matter. So I'll select all those faces and choose my bake again. It'll get overwritten by the new bake anyways. Go out of edit mode, and we're still in bake from multi-res. So of course there is no active objects that you can select because the multi-res is only influencing this one object. So let's bake, and we can see everything's blue. Let's select these faces so we can see where in theory our stripes have to appear. Just Ctrl+, and you see they should be somewhere around here, but they are not. Nothing visible, even though we baked from multi-res. Now why is that? The reason is, just as it is with a viewport, it will bake the difference between the viewport and the rendering. And right now the difference between the viewport and the rendering is 0. If we turn down the rendering, then we'll get the old coarse monkey, and it will try to mimic what we've sculpted, because the render is still at 2. Let's go back to the baking, we'll bake that again, and now you can see a lot of things happened, and let's find our mustache. It's right here, there we go. So this is how the baking of the multi-resolution works. And with that, I am finished discussing the Blender internal normal baking. And to learn how to bake normals in cycles, make sure you watch the next chapter, and also please do try this at home.